Amid the chaos in the Middle East, Christians are disappearing, and the West, which owes them the foundations of their culture, is looking away. The history of Christians in the Middle East spans 2,000 years. Their churches date from the 1st century, when Europe was still pagan. They were there before the advent of Islam. Discriminated under all regimes, often persecuted, they nevertheless survived. In the early 20th century in the Middle East, 1 in 4 people were Christians. Today, they are only 11 million among 320 million Muslims. They are in the minority everywhere, forced to seek protection from those in power in order to survive. Their history in Iraq, Turkey, Egypt, Lebanon and Syria reveals the reasons for their marginalization and demonstrates the fragility of their situation. In the fire that has engulfed this part of the world, for the Western powers, the Christians do not have any strategic value. Do they still have a future on the land where they began?
Who are the Christians in the Middle East? What's amazing is that the very idea of Christians in the Middle East surprises us. What should be surprising is that there are Christians in the West, because Christianity was born in the East. It is a religion that originated in Asia, Palestine. Therefore, Christians in the Middle East are the Christians who were originally there, in Palestine, and stayed and developed there. These are obviously the early Christians, the immediate disciples of Jesus Christ, and then the first communities that were created around Jerusalem, Damascus, Alexandria, Antioch, while we, the Gauls, were in our trees with the Druids. So we shouldn't be astonished by Eastern Christianity, but more by Western Christianity.
The spread of Christianity begins with the apostles, but it's with St. Paul of Tarsus, who evangelizes much of the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, that the church is born. St. Peter creates the first church in Antioch. St. Mark reaches Alexandria by sea and is at the origin of the Copts of Egypt. St. Thomas, the unbeliever, crosses Mesopotamia and Persia to arrive in Kerala in southwestern India, where he founded the church and converted thousands of Indians. At first, the message of Christ is taught in homes and then spreads from town to town through merchants and converted soldiers. The East is the origin of Christianity. With over 2 billion followers, it's the main religion in the world, and also the most persecuted. Thousands of Christians are killed every year because of their faith. A major reason for the threat that now hangs over Eastern Christianity is its identification with a West which is perceived as hostile and controlling. Christians in the Middle East are divided into 2 main types: Catholics that are faithful to Rome, and the others which are independent, divided into several churches, each obeying a patriarch. There are 6 different rites: the Byzantine, Armenian, Syriac, Chaldean, Maronite and Coptic. Although Christians in the Middle East only represent a small number compared to the total number of Christians in the world, the risk of their disappearance is a universal tragedy because they are living witnesses of the origins of Christianity.
It's true that very often in the West we forget these communities exist, and when we remember them, we are embarrassed by them. Particularly, it's a paradox that they're often persecuted in their own countries because they are seen to represent the West. But in the West, in secular lay politics, they're very often ignored precisely because they're Christian.
From the early 20th century, the West actually fuels the desire of Christians in the Middle East to form themselves into independent nations. But each time, the West betrays those expectations and doesn't go on to fulfill its promises. To understand Christians in the Middle East, we need to understand that they have always been caught between the West on one side and Islam on the other. And it has been like this for centuries.
The Christians did not arrive at any given time. They were the original citizens of these countries who then went on to welcome Islam and Muslims.
Some people, including the so-called Daesh, believe that ultimately these Christians should not live in this region. Either they convert to Islam, they leave, or they should be killed.
The emergence of the Islamic State in the heart of Iraq and Syria and its desire to establish a caliphate in which Christians no longer have their place has immersed Christians in a fierce war. In June 2014, Daesh troops broke through the Nineveh plain and seized Mosul, Iraq's second city. After some hesitation, Christians fled to the east towards Kurdistan.
I left everything behind me in Nineveh, where my ancestors were born, where my history is from. I struggled to bring myself to leave, but I had no choice. I certainly did not want to leave the city where I had grown up. I was torn from my city and its beautiful river. I grew up in a mixed city where there were lots of communities. Anyway, by making me leave the places that made up my history and that of my ancestors, Daesh killed me.
I think the question of the end of Christians in the Middle East was actually raised a long time ago. This is a question that was raised from the time of Saddam Hussein, as this Christian population, often depicted as representing the Ba'athist regime, bore the brunt of repression and authoritarianism in Iraq, and were, in fact, victims of history very early on.
Under the Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein, Christians were not perceived as a threat. They represented a population of 1.5 million people, and some held positions of high responsibility. But Christians were the first victims of the collapse of power after the US invasion of 2003.
When the Americans entered Iraq, which was not a complete success to say the least, the US president at the time said, "We are the new Crusaders." This phrase caused the deaths of hundreds of Christians accused of being friends of the Americans.
So, after being seen as collaborators with Saddam Hussein's regime, in the minds of the Sunni insurgents, Christians became collaborators with the Americans. And from 2004-2005, we saw a rise in attacks, especially jihadist violence against the people and against the churches, which are systematically attacked, against a number of dignitaries who are killed, murdered in cold blood. And the fall of the regime precipitates what we could call the extinction of the Christian presence in Iraq, but is really the extinction of Iraqi society more generally.
Housed in a half-built building made available by the Kurdish authorities, this refugee camp on the outskirts of Erbil was established in autumn 2014. It is home to 2,000 people, mostly Christians, but also Yazidis. For Father Najib Mishal, a Dominican Iraqi exiled to Kurdistan, it is essential not to separate different minorities.
We lived in Bartala when Daesh arrived. They said, "Go home, there's nothing to fear." After a month and a half, they asked us to convert to Islam. I said no. They said, it's either you or your husband or your children. My husband said, go with the kids, I'll stay here. They took my husband, and to this day, I do not know where he is. I have 3 children and no salary. I have nothing. My life is very difficult, and my little girl is sick. Members of Daesh banged her head against a wall. I feel bad for my children, and I do not know if my husband is alive or dead. Some say that he is dead. Others say that he is alive, and I just do not know.
I am a professor and head of department at the Institute of Fine Arts in Mosul. There are 5 people in my family. There's a well-prepared plan to remove the Christian population from the region. How long will the Christians put up with the orders and myths of the Islamic State, saying that the Christian is an infidel, that the Christian is this or that? We've suffered a lot. We've suffered for centuries, so we want to ensure the future of our children.
In its eradication frenzy, the Islamic State also attacks the culture of any people that preceded Islam. So for Daesh, everything that predates the arrival of Islam must be destroyed.
Since the arrival of the Islamic State in Mosul, I felt that there was a threat to culture. On the night of the 6th of August, I brought a big truck in which I put everything we have. Thousands of manuscripts and thousands of important documents, paintings, etc. I left with the truck and went through 3 checkpoints, without anyone asking what was inside. I felt that Providence and heaven were with us. Leaving the city, we saw kilometers of people running, especially children, including those who were bedridden, old men, women. So we stopped and filled up the cars, putting people on top of our manuscripts and archives until they were totally full. It was like Noah's Ark. And there we were at daybreak at the Kurdish checkpoint in Kalak. It was 5:30 a.m. We could not move. The borders were closed. And a young man said to me, "My father, look to your right." So I looked, and there was a swarm of Daesh cars with black flags hanging around. We didn't know where to go. The borders were closed for cars as a matter of security. After talking with the soldiers, they eventually let us leave on foot. But what do I do with the thousands of documents I have in both cars? I asked people to help me take what they could. So I gave manuscripts and archives to everyone, even people I didn't know. I asked, please, can you just help us to get them to the other side of the checkpoint? There were even children carrying manuscripts that were 1,000 years old, children who were carrying their history in their hands. And they ran on foot across the checkpoint. It was a real exodus.
All of our church's history started in Baghdad, in Babylon, and I feel like I have a mission. I am not just a patriarch for the Chaldeans, but for all Christians as well as for Muslims. Even if there aren't many Christians left, or very few, I'm here because I'm not just a patriarch for a small herd. And I believe that Muslims have much more need of me as a Christian than Christians do.
The real question is what to do on the ground to assist those that are prepared to fight the jihadists, the Islamic State, and particularly how to go about doing this. Because the reality is that there aren't many people left on the ground today. There are mostly militias.
The front line that extends from north to south of Iraqi Kurdistan is essentially a defensive line. It is held by Kurdish Peshmerga, in which some Christian militias and international volunteers are also fighting.
My name is Sergon Daniel. I'm from The Hague. I came here to join Duchnausha. I joined in December. I used to sell bread to markets. Yeah. And before that, I was geologist. We Christian, most of us are peaceful people. We just like peace and be safe. We don't like fight any other peoples. But that's enough. I think that's enough. We must do something. We mustn't stay at home and not doing anything. I'm staying here so other Assyrians see me, watch me, what I'm doing, so maybe they come back and be in their homeland, because this is our homeland.
Without local organization, Christians have no future. Without a compromise in the region between major regional powers to stop the bloodshed, Christians have no future on a larger scale in the Middle East.
I think there should always be a place for Christians and other religious minorities, or the Middle East will lose a lot of what it currently has. The majority of Muslims, the so-called moderate Islam, is aware that the region of the Near and Middle East is the birthplace of the great sacred religions. They know that if Christians were not there, they would lose something in terms of cultural plurality, political plurality, and the link with the rest of the world.
Bindungen zum Rest der Welt.
The situation of Iraqi Christians today is extremely precarious, and the history of Christians in Turkey tragically demonstrates what could happen to them: almost complete disappearance. In the early 20th century, the Christian community of the Ottoman Empire, which became Turkey, was the largest in the Middle East. The Tur Abdin is the historical birthplace of Syriac Orthodox Christians. It's called the Mountain of God's Servants. Mor Gabriel Monastery, founded in the late 4th century by two monks, is the symbol of one of the oldest churches of Christianity, the Syriac Orthodox Church. At its peak, during the 5th and 6th century, more than 1,000 monks inhabited the monastery. Islam penetrated the Christian world in the 7th century through conquest. Once they had won territories from the Byzantine Empire, the Arabs unified these regions through language, currency, and establishing a powerful and efficient administration.
When Islam arrived in the 7th century, it was people who were close to them. It was other Semites. They were people who knew the desert, camels, taking off shoes before entering someone's home. It is not a Muslim custom to remove their shoes before entering a mosque. It is an Arab custom. Somehow, Christians adapted well to the arrival of Muslims, especially as the Muslim prince, the caliph, the successor of the prophet, needed to run a vast empire, and he lacked experience. So often, Christians were ministers. There was a strong friendliness because Christians knew the language and the mentality well, and there are quite a number of texts, dialogues between Christians and Muslims on problems that today we wouldn't dare to tackle.
But the first caliphs established a special status for Christians, zimitude. This status is a submission agreement that defines Christians as second-class citizens.
The Muslim world considered local Christians as their protégés, in the condescending sense of the term. So there was discrimination, sometimes in their clothing, sometimes in access to certain jobs, and also in terms of taxes. They had to pay a tax which was the price for that tolerated status.
With the advent of the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century, the situation of Christians is normalized. The system of milits, which means nation in Turkish, recognizes Christians as a community represented by a patriarch, but still with a lower status. This system remains in place until the fall of the Ottoman Empire.
In the late 19th and early 20th century, there is a current of ideas embodied by the most nationalistic, which believes that there must be balance between belonging to the Ottoman Empire and religious affiliation to Islam. From then on, you could be Turkish and Muslim, but not Turkish and Christian. And this idea was taken up at the beginning of the Turkish Republic by Mustafa Kemal, who also formalizes this conception of citizenship that is reduced to religious and denominational affiliation.
This discrimination was sometimes violent, and when you are discriminating against someone, a time comes when the persecutions turn violent.
In 1915, a genocide planned and carried out by the Young Turks movement, who were in power in the Ottoman Empire, has 1.5 million Armenian Christian victims, or 2/3 of the population, and more than 50% of Assyrian Christians, nearly 260,000 people.
It's certainly true that one of the things that has fueled intolerance and the persecution of Christians has been the rise of nationalism. And that was one of the main factors that led to the genocide of Armenians and really the persecution of Christians.
100 years ago, other less-known populations who were victims of genocide include Assyrian populations, Chaldean and Syriac, who were victims of what in Aramaic is called seifo. Seifo means the sword in Aramaic. North of Mardin, there is a plateau in Syria called Tur Abdin, where part of the population was decimated and many churches were destroyed. Called ethnocide, that is to say a cultural genocide in addition to a physical genocide, 1 in 2 members of the community were tortured.
Ethnic cleansing committed against the Assyrian Christians during the First World War is now a forgotten genocide. Yet at the time, abuses against Christians were known to Western governments, church leaders, politicians, and military officers.
The irony of history is that the Assyrian Chaldeans, massacred today in Nineveh province in Iraq, are the descendants of the survivors of the 1915 genocide.
The repeated massacres and the fate of survivors allow us to understand how the population of the original birthplace of Assyrian Christians was drastically reduced during the 20th century. Today, there are only a few thousand Christians in Turkey, and their minority status leaves them in a very precarious situation.
One of the demands of this small community is to have a legally protected status that is currently denied by the political authorities. Armenians and Orthodox Jews have a form of legal protection and can be considered a community with cultural, political and religious rights. But other Christian minorities, Syriacs, Catholics, Protestants, evangelicals, which exist as well, although in a tiny minority, have absolutely no legal rights, as they are considered a collection of individuals.
Kafro is an emblematic village which was deserted by its inhabitants in 1994, and access to the area was forbidden by the Turkish army. In 2003, the ban was finally lifted. But although Christians are allowed to return and build houses, they are forbidden from rebuilding their churches.
The old town was here. I was born and I grew up in this house opposite. I lived there until the age of 19. At its peak, there were about 50 families living in this village. It's interesting, in 100 years, this village was emptied 3 times. 3 times it was destroyed and rebuilt in 100 years.
Tur Abdin is an interesting case. It is the will of a very few people, but even though they are few, what this means is important. They want to move back to Turkey and reclaim their roots, practicing their faith. And this is what happens. But how many people does it affect? 100, 150, maybe so. It's very much a minority phenomenon. And what is important is that firstly, they have the possibility of resettling in their homes or the place where their ancestors lived. And secondly, if they wish to, they can renovate or rebuild the buildings. It is rather the case of reconstruction. But they have a problem practicing their faith in the old churches.
This church is very old. It dates from the 5th or 6th century. As you can see, it has been damaged. I was baptized in this church. I got married in this church. And until I was 19, I came here every Sunday for Mass. The military has written some very ugly things on the walls. As you can see, the place where Mass is said has been vandalized. The ancient frescoes have been dismantled and taken away. But the state doesn't do anything about it, and we do not even have the right to hammer in a nail.
Turkey was once home to the largest Christian community in the Middle East, but this can now be found in Egypt. The Copts of Egypt are one of the main Christian communities in the Middle East. They date back to the 1st century. Nowadays, their exact number is a taboo in Egyptian society. They are estimated to make up between 6 and 15% of a population of over 90 million.
Basically, the Copts are Egyptians, since the word Coptic, Kupt in Arabic, is a kind of abbreviation of the Greek word Egyptos, meaning Egyptian. The Copts are the descendants of generations of Egyptians in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries who embraced Christianity and left the religion of their ancestors, the pharaohs. Most Muslims in Egypt are actually Copts, who over time have converted to Islam.
After enduring Ottoman and British rule, Egypt became independent in 1922. Sultan Fahd I became the first king of the new state. His son, Farouk, succeeded him in 1936. But in 1952, the Free Officers Movement, headed by Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser, overthrew the monarchy and established the Republic. This was the era of Pan-Arabism, an ideology which aims to unify the Arab people, a hope for the Muslim world in its aspiration to modernity.
In the first half of the 20th century, the Middle East was marked by the Pan-Arabist ideal. There were going to be Arab societies constructed that were modern. Arabism had been betrayed and was a failure, probably because the West had not supported it sufficiently. And Arabism was, alas, succeeded by Islamism. Obviously, in that context, Christians no longer feel welcome. They are excluded by a major part of society.
The following regimes, from Nasser to Mubarak, call themselves republicans, but in reality are trying to provide security to the Muslim majority. In the 90s, armed Islamist groups destabilize the state and attack the Christians. Caught in the crossfire, Copts find themselves alone, ignored by the international community, which is more anxious to preserve the stability of Hosni Mubarak's government. During the New Year Mass of 2011, the Copts are the target of a particularly heinous attack in the Alexandria Cathedral. An escalation in violence causes several deaths, and the perpetrators are never identified.
The relationship between the population and the regime deteriorated, which could be seen in the rise of protest movements, including strikes and demonstrations. And within the church, there was a parallel movement, of course, to a minor extent. But a number of elite secular Copts increasingly challenge this monopolization of speech and Coptic identity by the church and the hierarchy, challenging both the authoritarianism of the Pope and the majority of bishops, as well as their own compromise with the authoritarian regime.
January 25, 2011, revolution broke out in Cairo's Tahrir Square. Thousands of young Christians and Muslims defy the authority of President Mubarak and unite in the hope of a new citizenship, waving side-by-side crosses and Qurans. In 2012, the election saw a better organized Muslim Brotherhood gain power. The new President Mohamed Morsi passes a constitution that paves the way for a stricter Islam, confiscating secular ideals and citizens of the revolution. In June 2013, he was overthrown by the military. The reply comes quickly. All over Egypt, 60 churches are ransacked by supporters of the ousted president. The beautiful dream of Tahrir Square goes up in smoke.
The Islamists wanted to make the Copts pay, considering them to be some of the primary instigators of the movement that brought about Morsi's fall from power.
Like most Christians in the Middle East, the Copts are a minority in their own country and are forced to seek the protection of those in power. Coptic Pope Tawadros II and the bishops unconditionally support the new president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. For the first time in the country's history, an Egyptian president greets the Coptic community during Christmas Mass.
We don't have to ask, you are Egyptian, but of what religion? We're all going to love each other and show that to the world. We are Egyptians.
It is indisputable that for much of the Christian community, the advent of al-Sisi Marshal represented a kind of liberation.
Représentait une sorte de libération.
But there is a kind of similitude, this status of second-class citizen, that is growing, non-explicitly, day to day. Christians know very well that in the workplace, promotions will be less easily accessible to them than to Muslims. Moreover, the successive constitutions of Egypt since 1952 forbid a Christian from becoming President of the Republic or Prime Minister, or attaining a position of high responsibility.
In the heart of Egypt, near Luxor, between the Nile and the desert, we find the symbol of the Coptic resistance, the monastery of Deir el-Malak Mishal.
As Christians of Egypt, we lived much darker hours in previous centuries. Certainly, today, martyrs are killed, people are attacked, churches are burned, but Christians are still there.
At the head of a diocese of 620,000 inhabitants, of whom 25,000 are Christians, Bishop Biman is leading the fight for the Coptic revival. This charismatic prelate, a former architect, turned the monastery into a teaching centre that can accommodate several thousand faithful.
We aspire to be a centre of influence in all areas. In addition to agricultural activities, we have carpentry workshops, trade, ironwork, farms, and all kinds of activities. We offer work to whoever deserves and who is competent, without any religious discrimination.
Near the monastery on the Nile, in the town of Nakwada, Bishop Biman has begun construction of a new church. Christians throughout the region are encouraged to come to worship, including the children, who, every Friday, have a 2-hour mass dedicated to them.
One cannot deny that there is a Coptic revival, which began a number of decades ago. The monasteries are full of monks, churches are full, but at the same time, you can actually see a certain drop in the Christian mentality. The danger is that Christians become a small island within the population.
The spirit of conquest embodied by Bishop Biman can be considered paradoxically as the reflection of a community that is likely to be edged out of history. One country is an exception in the Middle East, Lebanon, the only Arab country where Christians are not in the minority and they fully participate in political life. Mainly Maronites, they represent 43% of the population, alongside other religions. Shiite Muslims 27%, Sunni Muslims 23%, Druze 4%, and Alawites 3%. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire, an ally of the defeated Germany, is dismantled. The Middle East is re-divided by the victors into the current states: Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and later Israel.
France and Britain divided the Middle East between them 100 years ago, and it's certainly the case that that division formed the basis for today's political geography, ran roughshod over local differences, over ethnic differences, religious differences, and paid no attention to them. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was very much designed to resolve tensions between the two allies, rather than to accommodate local differences in the Middle East.
In April 1920, France is given a mandate over Syria and Lebanon, which at the time is one large area. Its desire to curb the nationalist aspirations by dividing the territory provokes differing reactions among Christians.
What the French did was to divide Lebanon from Syria, to try to create a Christian enclave, which would be effectively a base arrière, something that they could hang on to and that would be a majority Christian area where they felt more secure. And then in Syria, they further divided it, and they divided it between the Sunni, the Alawites, and the Druze to create little states, statelets. France did definitely embark on a policy of divide and rule.
Unlike their Maronite brothers in Lebanon, the Syrian Christians aspire to create a great Arab nation. At the beginning of the French Mandate, the Syrian people revolt. If Syrian Christians do not participate in this military action, they will be at the forefront of political resistance to the French, who have colonial designs on the region. This spirit of resistance embodied by the Christians pervades civil society and unites them with the Sunni Muslims, who are in the majority in the country.
During the period of the Mandate, the Sunni Muslim leader of Damascus was close to the Mandate authorities, and the Christian leader was close to the resistance, while in the great mosque of Damascus, Umayyad, the most coveted place by the Muslim faithful, believers claimed that their imam was the Christian bishop and not the Sunni sheikh by nationalism.
What it fails to build in Syria, France will create in Lebanon, a state where Christians are in the majority and where they have strong political power. France governed Lebanon, under the mandate it has been given just after San Remo, until World War II. And this is when Lebanon's independence was decided, she says. The President of the Republic, who was a Christian Maronite, confirmed a verbal agreement, which remained verbal, with the Sunni Prime Minister at the time. And this agreement, which is still called the Pact of 1943, was in fact the foundation of the development of modern Lebanon, she says. This verbal pact of 1943 divided political power between different faiths. It stipulates that the President of the Republic and the Chief of Staff will always be a Maronite Christian, the Prime Minister a Sunni Muslim, and the Speaker of Parliament a Shia Muslim.
We built a kind of laboratory of institutionalized dialogue with the Christian presence that maybe marks the identity of Lebanon. Lebanon is the key to the Middle East.
In 1975, the presence of Palestinian combatants destabilizes Lebanon and triggers a terrible civil war that lasts 15 years and causes around 200,000 deaths. A war which pits everybody against each other and also sees bloody fighting between Christians. In 1990, the guns fell silent after 15 years, leaving a destroyed capital and a country in ruins. And the Christians entered a deep depression, she says. Why? Because they had the feeling that the political agreements that ended the war, the Taif Agreement, where all of the Lebanese parliament had been summoned to meet in Arabia to create a new constitution, Lebanese Christians felt that they had not only lost the war, but they had also lost Lebanon, she says. This feeling of a loss of power, even today the Lebanese Christians do not know how to manage their own destiny. This is what made them an historic exception, she says. They are the only non-Muslim community which had managed, through history, to control its own destiny by sharing it with Muslims, she says. Today, the two major Muslim communities, Sunni and Shiite, were able to take control of running the country. Sunnis have Saudi Arabia as their reference, Shiite have Iran and the Christians, she says.
C'est personne, c'est eux. Les chrétiens du Liban, assez intelligents.
The Christians of Lebanon, quite intelligently, split themselves into two. And the question that everyone asks is this: have they done it in a concerted way or not? Probably not, she says. While some of the Christians allied themselves with the Sunnis, and therefore with Saudi Arabia, and the rest of the Lebanese Christians allied themselves to Shiite, and therefore Iran. And somehow, this division of Christians into two saved them by preventing further anti-Christian discourse in Lebanon, she says.
Au Liban.
بسم الآب والابن والروح القدس طابع وملء نعمة الروح القدس تطبع أمة الله ماريا ريتا بسم الآب
This is to show everybody that we are sure that Christians will remain in the Middle East and live out their faith. It is a testimony, she says.
It's a testimony that is very important for the entire world.
We in Lebanon, the Christians of Lebanon, Syria, and even the entire Middle East will remain true messengers of God, of Jesus in the world. Even when we emigrate, we are messengers, and we will continue to play that role all over the world, she says.
Christians that are not threatened are not Christians. Today it's Daesh. Several hundreds of years ago it was the Ottomans, and it goes on.
A new element of disaster for Christians in the Middle East is the civil war between Muslims, between Sunnis and Shiites. For reasons that are quite complex but come down to a quite simple one, basically, Shiites are the best supporters of Christians because they too are a minority within Islam and so find it easier to support fellow minorities. But this is the curse of Christians in the Middle East because the West has chosen to follow a pro-Sunni politics and to accompany Saudi Arabia, the UEA and Turkey. And this is a total paradox because it is these states that are responsible for the rise of Islamism in Daesh, either directly or indirectly.
In Syria, Christians are caught in a war that has been raging for 5 years, and the forces on the ground testify that the conflict now pits Sunni Saudi Arabia against Shiite Iran. On the one hand, the Syrian army of Bashar al-Assad, backed by Lebanese Hezbollah and Iranian troops. On the other, Islamist brigades and what remains of the Free Syrian Army. Daesh, occupying part of the territory, has further complicated the issue by attacking in turn the government and moderate opposition.
The events unfolding in the Middle East clearly show that there is a plan which is playing out, and what is happening in Syria illustrates it very well. The main consequence will be that Syria will be emptied of its Christians.
The Syrian Christians represent 10% of a population consisting of 78% Sunni Muslims and 10% Alawites.
Part of the central core of power consists of the Alawite community, and so their relationship with the Christians of Syria is very important. I would not say it is an alliance, but more a partnership of minorities in a country that is predominantly Sunni Muslim. So there was always this certain will from those in power by Bashar Assad and his father at the time of Hafiz Assad to protect the Christians. That's undeniable. And conversely, Christians in their diversity across all communities of different rights feel or felt protected by the government.
Hafiz Assad from the Alawite minority took power in 1970. He established an authoritarian regime that allowed the Secret Service to infiltrate Syrian society as a whole and even to construct religious hierarchies for Muslims and Christians which controlled the appointment of imams and bishops.
The exploitation of religion for political ends began with the arrival of Hafiz Assad to power in 1970. The Assad family understood that religion had to be used and exploited. And the whole of society was structured to prevent the development of the concept of citizenship, because if a society is based around the theme of citizenship, it can be dangerous and risks rallying together and claiming rights. The events that began in 2011 proved this. There were many young Christians who were demonstrating at the beginning of the Syrian revolution in 2011. These were denounced even by their bishops to the authorities.
In the footsteps of his father, Bashar al-Assad exploits communities. He uses the civil war and the Islamist threat to push men of the church to show their support for the regime.
Religious systems and Christian religious authorities have joined forces with the government because they believe that if Muslim extremists take power, they will be exterminated.
Before the war, there were 1,800,000 Christians for 23 million individuals. They are now only a few hundred thousand. 6 million Syrians of all faiths have left the country, including nearly 1 million Christians.
From that point, what we must understand is that Christians are leaving because after 14 or 15 centuries of resistance, for the first time, they feel they can no longer resist. Christians only have one option left, and that is to leave. They go to a West that often they think of as Christian, and they discover it as completely secularized. They can survive physically there, but not spiritually, as they no longer have the necessary environment to transmit their identity. So culturally, we are really facing a disaster. We are truly facing an event that seems to prefigure what will happen from now on, that their identities will only be deadly or folkloric. And what Christians of the Middle East signaled in history was this ability to mediate between the two religions, since they accompanied the birth of Christianity and the birth of Islam, and so they have always been in between the two. But our world does not want mediation or in-between, and that's what the Christians of the Middle East show us. That's why their drama is not a special one, it is a universal drama, which gives us a tragic picture of tomorrow's world and shows us that our indifference is even more shameful.
Now, those societies in the Middle East were also sensitive ecological systems in which Christians and Jews and Muslims and Yazidis need each other if they are to flourish. And if we allow one species of faith to become extinct, then everything is impoverished. And when they die, we die.